Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I hope y'all are doing well. This is the Economancer. Today we're going to have a discussion. We're going to be talking about policy theory and its implications. And so I think this is going to be a fun one. So we're going to start off. Public discourse in the United States of America as it relates to public policy at the federal level has increasingly been considered to be pointless. The pessimism is stemmed from the idea that actual policy change can never occur in the USA. A few perspectives could help explain the thought processes at play here. There's the neo-Marxist position, I'm sure I'll catch some flack for that postulates that as long as the hegemonic power structures of the bourgeoisie class are instantiated in modern society, no meaningful change can happen because the ruling class is a powerful obstacle to the working class and its allies. That's from Schwarz-Mantel, 2014. However, this focus here will be leading to the theoretical approaches in the policy domain, such as economics, sociology, and political science. To explore this topic, we will look at public choice economics, neo-institutionalism, and sociological institutionalism. We will find a pessimistic view of policymakers from the perspective of public choice, and this identifies the different objective functions and incentives. In the neo-institutionalist, we will establish the case for how institutions develop and change over time, given path dependency and feedback loops. By utilizing the sociological institutionalist framework, we could establish the boundaries for institutional change and how those feedback loops impact differentially. Furthermore, this will attempt to provide an argument for and against the idea that nothing ever gets done in Washington. The last part of this essay will be primary defense in favor of making it harder to achieve policy change in the USA. So, we have an empty Washington. Federal legislation is generally slow in the USA. As bills go from the House to the Senate to the President, numerous committees and policy experts must discuss the bill between these different designations. The policy process for the federal government is encumbered by checks and balances associated with the different branches and political parties. However, that does not answer whether true policy change could happen. When discussing federal legislation, we should seek to understand the institution from a formal and evolutionary perspective. The formal perspective provides insight into the legal powers, procedural rules, and formal structures of the legislator, allowing us to infer how these impact participant behaviors in the process. The evolutionary perspective should allow us to understand how path-dependent processes have shaped the rule and structural arrangements, and that is from North 2012. Neo-institutional, as it was originally proposed by Douglas North and Oliver Williamson, laid out that preferences were most often to be taken as given. Preferences were taken as given in most accounts because institutions change the uncertainties people face and alter the price individuals pay, thereby altering their choice structure. Again, North 2012 and Williamson 1987. Thus, if we look at the institutional structures of the U.S. and how they've evolved from the humble beginnings, we would find reasonable evidence that formal constraints of federal policymaking are meant to be slow. This is Sunstein, 1985. An example would be the Senate rules and norms that favor the minority, such as debate rules requiring 60 votes and possible unanimous consent to call up legislative measures for a vote. That's Eisen 2007. The formal rules of the U.S. lawmaking body were designed to limit the number of policies that could be enacted to protect the minority citizens from majority rule. Therefore, the path-dependent policy process in the U.S. maintained a slow and methodical approach to change. The public choice approach proposes that legislators delegate powers to bureaucracies in pursuit of self-interest. Suppose a policymaker will always face re-election. It is clear from the rational choice perspective that a policymaker would delegate power to an inefficient bureaucracy that creates issues for the voting populace. Therefore, the voting population requires assistance, which the policymaker can assist with in exchange for votes. It follows that if there were a primary issue that the population wanted to be fixed, it would no longer receive the level of attention because of the self-interested behavior of the policymakers. Anderson, 2006. Thus, resources are not being used in solving the first order problem originally voiced by the public, but the resources are used to fix a problem created by the policymaker. The inherent inefficiency of this creates problems where the resources for change and shakeout strategies are limited, which maintains the status quo. Lastly, consider both previous theories, and in addition of groups attempting to position their goals for rent-seeking. That's Crowley, 2003. The rent-seeking behavior of policy entrepreneurs provides strong evidence that over time, the different groups, as they are disaggregated by policymakers, and what that means is Schneider and Ingram in 1993 proposed that policymakers attempt to champion different groups, which segments the groups along socially constructed borders. This weakens the ability of the groups to build enough pressure to enact change. Under these circumstances, we find it reasonable to assume that the pressure groups would lead to a stable equilibrium where there is limited change from the status quo. That's Becker, 1985. Now we have the evolving federalism. Despite the considerable amount of voice in public discourses, there have and continue to be radical changes in policy. To understand the evolving process, we begin with cultural capital. The primary source for cultural capital is presented in Bourdieu, 2011. I'm sure many of you have heard me talk about this. Cultural capital is what a cultural group maintains as the ability to exchange for other types of capital. These are very specific behaviors that have been modified by the norms that make changes to how people interact. Thus, cultural capital can be exchanged for other types of capital, including political capital. That's from Gaventa, 2003. The exchange of capital provides the mechanism for change as habitus, that's the internalization of social processes, synonymous with socialization from Parsons, has built-in inertia where the social relation to power is changed as different capital is exchanged and resources are limited, Navarro, 2006. Therefore, the exchange of capital allows different classes of people to exert long-run political influence to change the system. For example, scholar Jocelyn Crowley notes the changes to child support legislation and enforcement from 1950 to 1998 and the different sets of policy challengers. Again, that's from Crowley, 2003. One of the most powerful influencers in policymaking is the social constructivist theory. Social constructivist theory proposes that policy design is shaped by the pressures of positive and negative group biases that are constructed and institutionalized through differential policy impact and messaging. Schneider and Ingram, 1993. The social constructivist theory is key to understanding the evolving policy landscape as advantaged groups vie for power. The groups are continuously divided into smaller segments as politicians compete to champion the constructed groups, Schneider and Ingram, 93. Building off the social constructed theory, special interest groups provide explanatory power to the changes in policy as group pressures from the constructed populations lead to changes as policymakers act on that self-interest, Anderson, 2006. Furthermore, the statement that nothing ever gets done in Washington itself has an amplifying negative effect on people's perceptions. For collective action to take place, there needs to be sufficient support from the population. But supposing that the population is too demoralized to cooperate, nothing will get done. Snow et al., 1986. However, as Kirman, 1987 noted, there has been extensive records in the U.S. government with many significant changes manifesting in the public spirit overcoming self-interests. For example, Kelman argues that self-interest could not account for the increases in spending for those less well off. There was little in the political landscape to suggest that the poor were a strong interest group during this time. However, the public spirit, power of ideas, and persuasiveness of policymakers emerged as significant to contributors to change in the U.S., Kelman, 1987. Last, given the ample evidence that there has been continued change in the U.S. policies, it is empirically false to claim nothing in Washington gets done. However, there is room for argument, as discussed in the introduction, that the retrenchment of policies in the U.S. provides evidence that no change has happened. Hacker 2004 argues that the stickiness in the political arena that has protected social policies has also led to a severe lag from the dramatic social changes to the policies of the US. However, not all legal changes are necessary to enforce new rules in society when considering the microsphere. Ellickson, 1991. With the enforcement of new rules, political divisions are organized, which sets forth a dependent path that reproduces those rules until they become institutionalized. Pearson, 2000. Therefore, the conditions of change following some lag will become one of the dominant political domains resulting in change. Conservatism as a search algorithm. The statement that nothing gets done in Washington is meant to be a case of fear that nothing will ever change, or cynical musings on the slow pace of institutional change. However, when we view public policy through the conservative lens, there is unabashed happiness in the tone. Contrary to popular belief, conservatism is a process for finding optimal solutions by using the principle of prudence. The principle of prudence states that public policy should be determined by long-run consequences and their corollary unintended consequences, not merely by transient advantage or favor. Kirk, 2014. Another description of this principle comes from the scholar Friedrich Hayek, who saw successful societies emerge through trial and error across generations in the market and political systems in successful societies. Bowles et al., 2017. Therefore, we will attempt to argue that despite the level of transparency in the policymaking system in the U.S., the process should be slower. To present this case, we must first understand what public policy is. Public policy is the purposive course of action developed by government bodies and officials in dealing with a problem of public attention. Anderson, 2006. We know the public has a problem and look to the government to eliminate or lessen the problem. However, most problems would be solved without government intervention. For example, informal social control is a powerful mechanism that can motivate or punish behavior for promoting the group's social welfare. Ellickson, 1991, provides a comprehensive investigation of disputes between various ranchers in Shasta County, California. The rancher disputes demonstrate that social dynamics are governed mainly by informal rules that emerge without direct top-down intervention. Furthermore, Ellickson describes the feedback loops that change an individual's internal disposition to a rule or law as the social system has competing influences. Therefore, a single law contains many contexts and increases the relative complexity of day-to-day operations, limiting their actual impact on everyone. For example, Ellickson describes the lack of distinction between open and closed range when disputes arose about trespass damage claims. One of the primary concerns of the conservative is the concentration of power. Kirk, 2014, provides two more principles for this. Conservatives are chastened by their principle of imperfectibility, and the conservative perceives the need for prudent restraints upon power and upon human passions. Stigler, 1971, provides a strong argument for limiting the ability of the government to enact policy at will. Stigler showed that the intersection of business and government set up a perverse set of incentives and revolving doors that would negatively affect industry and citizen. The primary argument is that the state is a powerful system that can selectively hurt or help any industry, such that an industry is incentivized to acquire regulation for its benefit. By acquiring regulation, the industry can use the state's monopolized powers of force, enabling the industry to become more profitable. Once the different systems have structurally coupled is used to describe inter-system connections where the systems can coordinate and influence one another. Luhmann, 2013. They can grow through a shared medium of exchange, money, limit the freedoms of other industries and citizens. Last, the conditions of adaptive efficiency, as defined in North 2012, favor the conservative process as an institutionalized gradual evolution in the decision-making process. By limiting the government and policies to specific domains, the markets and social norms are free to evolve through emergent properties described earlier by Hayek. Because there is increased room for evolution, and limited government interference, there is an increase in transparency in legislation. Therefore, the conservative process and principle favors the slow and limited changes initially set up by the founders of the U.S. The founders saw limiting the government's ability to act on majoritarian policies as primary in defending property rights, Sunstein, 1985. Furthermore, as Sunstein, 1985 discussed, representatives must be delivered and not persuaded by public pressure in the Madisonian policy process. All of the arguments presented in favor of slowing down the process of public policy should be taken under suspicious consideration. However, much like Brennan and Buchanan in 1988, the moral argument rests on a constitutional perspective that the appropriate unit to observe and analyze is not the politician, but the set of rules and expectations that modify or constrain their behaviors. In this, we discussed the statement that nothing ever gets done in Washington and that actual policy change never occurs. We used theoretical perspectives from sociology, economics, and political science to explore three arguments. The first argument was designed to show that the statement was correct and provided three sub-arguments. The formal structure of the U.S. is designed to be a slow process that benefits the minority. Path dependence of institutions lead to stagnation in policy outcomes where changes are limited because the path constrains policymaking choices. And third, because self-interest of policymakers, much of the prospective policy changes people want to be enacted are delegated to an inefficient bureaucracy that the politician then uses as a way to attract more votes. The second argument proposed that the counter-argument that there is considerable and constant change in the U.S. The three sub-arguments are presented as: 1. Because cultural capital can be exchanged for political capital, underrepresented groups can exert long-run influence, creating change. Second argument, the powerful force of social constructivist theory allows for interest groups to become part of the political process as politicians seek votes by championing different groups through policy. Third argument, because informal social controls regulate behavior for groups and as time passes, the reproduction of these norms lead to path dependency, the policy change comes after some lag from the initial informal controls. The last argument presented the case that the policy ought to move slow through a conservative process and the principle of prudence. The three sub-arguments are presented as: 1. For most issues that supposedly need government intervention, the informal social controls can sufficiently and efficiently deal with them. Second argument, conservatives are concerned with the concentration of power and have preference for limited government policies because of the imperfectibility of man and the need to restrain human passions. Third argument, limiting the government's ability to enact policies leads to better conditions for the market and social norms to adapt toward optimal outcomes. The most important part of this was to show that in the realm of public policy, a primary and often forgotten tool in the empiricist toolbox is theory. In answering this, we could find empirical evidence to support one side of an argument, which presupposes that the opposition agreed to the three theoretical presuppositions. For example, at the beginning of this essay, there was an argument from the neo-Marxist Antonio Gramsci that no true change can happen until the bourgeoisie cultural hegemon is destroyed. Nevertheless, the essay provided numerous examples of U.S. policy change. But was that sufficient to be considered true change? Individuals such as Douglas Norris would say the evolution of institutions is evident, but others like Jacob Hacker would state that the current conditions are inhospitable to large-scale changes. Therefore, it is clear that those who study public policy should focus heavily on understanding the different theoretical perspectives and practice the principle of charity when evaluating opposing policies. This has been the Economancer. I hope you've enjoyed this and have a wonderful day.